to the Delegates Lounge. Pull up a chair. I'm Alex Tarquinio, a journalist based at the United Nations here in New York City, and your MC for this podcast, featuring some of the most influential minds in the world today. Settle in for some riveting tete-a-tete, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Welcome back. Today we're bringing you the final episode in our mini-series with a Canadian volunteer on the Ukrainian battle lines. As returning listeners will know, Dave Smith walked away from his career as a major with the Canadian Armed Forces to become a volunteer fighter with the Belarusian unit supporting Ukraine known as the Kalinowski Regiment. If you're just joining us, we interviewed Dave in July as he was rotating back into battle with the regiment for the fourth time, and again at the end of October as he was preparing to return home from Ukraine. Part 1 in this mini-series introduced listeners to Dave's story and motivations for leaving a secure military career. Part 2 featured Dave's impressions from the battlefield, focusing on the human aspects of warfare, such as fighting conscripts, capturing prisoners of war, and receiving medical care for a shrapnel wound. Geopolitical events are moving at such a rapid clip that shortly after we spoke in October, the Pentagon estimated that about 11,000 North Korean troops had moved into Russia's Kursk region. We spoke with Dave about this significant development a few days after the election of former American President Donald Trump. It should be noted that our third conversation happened well before the lightning-fast downfall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, a geostrategic shift of such importance that it might be viewed in the future as a turning point in multiple conflicts, with Russia losing a bastion of support in the region. During our first two conversations, Dave spoke with us from Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. In November, he spoke from London, where he was en route back home to Canada. This third and final episode is a compilation of Dave's musings on geopolitics and the military lessons he's learned the hard way in the unforgiving school of war. Frank, what did you find most compelling in Dave's take on the new tech and tactics that are evolving on the front lines of Russia's war in eastern Ukraine?
As Dave mentions, he and his fellow Belarusians encountered Russian meat waves, which describes the daily persistent and often hapless Russian infantry assaults against Ukrainian defenses. It is the key component of Russia's modus operandi. The meat is recruited throughout Russia by the coaxing or coercion of civilians into signing military contracts with the promise, not always kept, of big payouts should they be wounded or, even more lucratively, killed. Once inducted, these raw recruits receive barely minimal training and are rushed to the front to fill the ranks of the lead assault elements. These waves are normally tactically small in scale, but when executed across a wide front, they can, at points, dislodge or even on occasion overwhelm Ukraine's defenses. Fortunately, not Dave and his Belarusian comrades. As Dave points out, it is a methodology based on the acceptance of attrition as a viable military doctrine. Each meat wave is a targeted and desperate sprint to make it to the other side of no man's land. They resemble a cross between the South Korean drama series The Squid Game and Hitchcock's The Birds. The Korean idea is not lost on Russian recruiters who seem so inspired they copy it. See the show notes. Once the meat wave is ordered forward, there's no escape. Play dead, and the drones, the birds, as Russian soldiers call them, will find you and make sure you are. Survival depends on innate Darwinian instinct rather than a regimen of expensive NATO-style training. Casualty rates are high, but nonetheless, if the attack is successful, and at the moment many of them are, it is relative to a NATO army doing the same thing cost-effective. A Russian recruiter for this purpose may cost $50,000 or $60,000 if killed, whereas a trained-up NATO soldier employed the same way, perhaps one day by necessity, as Dave warns, would cost her anywhere from half to a full $1 million. Ironically, the North Koreans may be the next contestants in this real-world Squid Game. Only expect the payouts to go directly to Kim Jong-un.
Cynically, as Dave points out, Putin has so far conducted an attritional war without the casualty rates triggering a call for a potentially regime-toppling general mobilization. This crypto mobilization, although expensive, is hidden from and demands no sacrifice of blood by the Russian majority, only their treasure. It impacts the undesirables the marginalized, the desperate, in other words, the voiceless in Russia, and is therefore no great loss to their influential fellow citizens. Dave describes the repression used to keep Alexander Lukashenko's grip on power in Belarus, which his comrades feel intensely. Even before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, many of Dave's comrades were already opponents of Lukashenko, who they believe had lost the 2020 presidential election in Belarus to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya.
Incidentally, we interviewed Svetlana at NATO's Washington summit, and listeners can find that episode in our playlist. During this episode, you'll hear Dave refer to the KGB when talking about Belarus. As I'm sure our listeners are aware, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation renamed its National Intelligence Agency, and the acronym changed from KGB to FSB. But Belarus kept the old unreformed name of its intelligence agency, so it's still called the KGB.
One last thing that needs to be pointed out, and that is there's a common military acronym that Dave uses throughout the interview, and that is TTP, which stands for Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures. These are guidelines that are constantly under development that are followed by NATO soldiers so that they can accomplish their missions.
Dave spoke eloquently about the incongruity of his daily life in Kharkiv, a frontline city that he described in the previous episode as the last stop before Mordor. In recent months, he's divided his time between the front lines and a rented apartment that he shared with a comrade from his regiment that was only 34 kilometers, or around 20 miles, from their position on the Zero Line. We'll include a link to Dave's most recent article in the online magazine Marion West, describing the rhythm of life in Kharkiv in the show notes for this episode. We started our third conversation by asking Dave about the lessons he had learned fighting in Ukraine. He focused on the big picture first. So that's where we'll begin.
I would just like to thank you guys once again for inviting me back. And I can't tell you how happy it makes me to talk to you again. I know for a fact that my mom and my wife both listened to your podcast because they both messaged me to point out how Alex was on their side regarding the seriousness of my fake shrapnel injury. So I can tell you that there's at least 2 listeners that you gained from the last podcast. The first thing I would say, and it's not really Ukraine specific, is this is just the context that I'm coming from for the rest of our discussion. It's a Ukrainian phrase, and it goes, "Я просто солдат." It means I am just a soldier. And it's what you say when someone asks you a question you don't know the answer to. My experience in Ukraine, it gives me some perspective on what's going on geostrategically, but that perspective is extremely limited. So here's a very simple way to think about strategy. You wake up in the morning, you look out the window, you look at the world, and you ask yourself 2 important questions. The first thing you ask is, what do I want this world to look like? How do I want it to change? Or how do I want it to stay the same? And how you answer that line of questioning is your strategic end state. It's your objective, it's your North Star, it guides all your decisions. The second question you have to ask yourself is, how am I going to bring that new world about? What do I need to change, and how am I going to cause that change to happen so that I achieve my strategic end state? Or you'll hear this called the theory of change or the theory of victory. The free world right now, we have no strategy. We know generally what we want. Our leaders, our presidents, our prime ministers, they recite platitudes about free and fair elections or the rules-based international order, territorial integrity, and a bunch of other jargon that no one understands or even cares about. I can tell you from firsthand experience, no soldier ever ran out on the battlefield and died for the rules-based international order. It means nothing. But we've never articulated what we want to change or stay the same to make the world more free. Then on the flip side, like dictators, they're looking out the window and they know their strategic objective. It's destroy the free world. And they're quickly figuring out how to make that happen. And I would say what's happened from the time that I left Canada to when I'm, coming home now is a year and a half ago, I actually thought we had a chance to stop them. And now I'm just convinced we don't. Like they're winning. It's like 1938, except that we're facing half a dozen Hitlers and all the Hitlers are working together. And the rest of the world is run by Chamberlains, and we're pretending there is no war going on. And this is what I mean when I say the free world is being strategically defeated by the unfree world. And we all see the same world, and that world is becoming more the way they want it and less the way free people want it to be. So that understanding of strategy is the context for all my answers to your questions.
Maybe you can start by telling us about your journey from Kharkiv and all the machinations you had to do to get safely out of Ukraine.
So my journey from Kharkiv to here was about 2 weeks long. I left Kharkiv. It was the day before the U.S. election. It was November 4th. So I went back to Kyiv on November 4th. It was sad, to be honest, leaving my apartment in Kharkiv. I lived there for about 4 months, one of my Belarusian comrades. The hardest thing to explain, it's just what it's like living in a place that's at war. Because people have asked me questions like, what do you eat? They just assume we're in a war zone all the time. They don't really realize we're actually in a functioning country. And where I lived in Kharkiv, I had a points card to my favorite grocery store. I had a gym membership. There was a post office I went to regularly enough that they knew my name and they knew my address. So living there was really one of the unique experiences of being in the conflict.
What you're describing sounds almost like a normal city, except for the occasional missile strikes. You arrived in Kharkiv not long after Ukraine's successful counteroffensive in late 2022. How have you seen Kharkiv change over the last 2 years?
So first of all, the people that are there, you could evacuate the city. Russia could come back. Like, they're never going to leave. And even when the city was going to be evacuated last spring, very little of the remaining population left. And I will say the city is scarred. Like, it is wrecked. There are bombed out buildings. It's a hipster paradise. Like, there are cafes and tattoo parlors everywhere. When I walked right outside my apartment, there was like a skate shop that sold like American skater apparel. And that never closed. You walk 2 blocks away and there's a building that's literally just, it's a shell of a building because it's been bombed so many times. So it's normal in that, that meme from World War II the Brits had, keep calm and carry on. That kind of encapsulates the attitude in Kharkiv, but it wouldn't be keep calm and carry on. It would be keep calm, kill invaders. Do you need a hipster coffee while you're waiting?
Have you spent much time in Kyiv, and have you noticed any changes there?
Things have definitely changed in Kyiv. I made a conscious effort to talk to as many Ukrainians as I could, and Belarusians as well, about the US election, Trump winning and everything. And I definitely get the impression in Kyiv, the civilians are just worn out. They're tired. Everybody's actually quite reluctantly happy that Trump won, because whatever happens might be cuckoo banana pants insane, but at least something's going to happen. You know what I mean? And it's the indecisive nature of what's been going on, especially since the counteroffensive started last year. That's really what's grinding people down, is the indecisiveness of it.
Well, we're speaking after the presidential election in the United States. And for listeners, we're recording this on the day that Biden and Trump are meeting. So Biden is a lame duck. Is there anything you would hope for before he leaves office in January?
One would hope a Biden administration or an EU would have a strategy to affect the kind of change that I was talking about earlier. Like, when I look out the window, I want the world to be more free. And I say, how could we achieve that? Well, we definitely got to get all the Russians out of Ukraine, for starters. Well, how do we go about making that change happen? Okay, let's develop a theory of change and then work towards it, right? The West has had 2.5, 3 years almost, and they haven't done it. Like, no one has had that conversation. They've done lots of virtue signally support for Ukraine, but nobody's had an actual strategy. Now Trump's going to show up, and he's very good at bending the world to his will and making it how he wants. I don't think he's like a master military strategist or anything. To quote the great strategist Tony Soprano, a bad decision is better than indecision. And right now, the free world is run by indecisive leaders and therefore can't have pursuable strategies. Donald Trump's lots of things, but he's not indecisive. He's going to show up in his first week, get briefed, and be like, here's what I want to happen. And he's going to make it happen. And, the rest of us are just going to have to deal with it.
Are you worried about whether Trump will enforce NATO's Article 5 in the event that any NATO allies were attacked? I mean, there's the campaign quote by Trump saying that if countries didn't pay up, whatever that means, then he would encourage Russia to do, quote, whatever the hell they want.
That statement by Donald Trump, I've thought about it a lot since it happened, because on the surface of it, it's so easy to agree with him. I actually would say I do agree with him. It's like if you join a gym and you don't pay the dues to the gym, they tell you you're not allowed in the gym. I think what was so shocking about him saying it is, and it's kind of obvious from his first term, the guy is just opposed to alliances. Everyone watching could tell he's just out to destroy this alliance relationship. He's not trying to effectively manage the alliance. He's trying to tear it down. I think that's where the real fear of him not supporting Article 5 comes from, is that you can kind of sense this attitude coming off of him, right? Because the secret of their power is alliance management, and it has been for 80 years or longer. The Russians had like an avowed policy. Like the goal was to keep Turkey and Hungary and all these NATO countries destabilized in the NATO alliance so that an Article 5 reaction couldn't be triggered, at least since 2014, but since long before then as well. Well, now it's like the only guarantor of the European security umbrella seems kind of questioning the mandatory nature of an Article 5 trigger. So it's like they've basically achieved what they want. At least the seed of doubt is there.
Once NATO becomes a paper tiger, then how can you possibly draw up a strategy that's even plausible? I mean, once he undermines the deterrence effect of having a NATO, then it percolates down to even to the tactical level.
Just to be clear, I think the world order that we've already moved into is scary and frightening. But it's not scary and frightening because I don't think Donald Trump will honor an Article 5 trigger. It's that he probably is going to end wars. Like there probably is going to be a ceasefire in Ukraine within the next, 3 to 12 months or whatever because of Donald Trump. And maybe he'll have some sort of impact on the Middle East. But if those wars end and they end because of deals that he brokered, they're not going to end because of the rule of law, because of some sort of liberal democratic understanding of justice that we've all agreed to. You know what I mean? If you attack one of our friends, we're all going to come to their aid. There's going to be a world order based on fear, because Donald Trump is going to say, like, I will guarantee the world order, but it'll be the world order that I and America want it to be, and it will be imposed through fear. And I think the other thing is Americans, rightfully, they really are. I think there is an awakening going on in Europe and in the US. America either can't or won't defend the global order the way it has for the last 8 decades. And I actually think Trump's more of a symptom of this than a cause, right? I think it's just the luster of globalism has really worn off. And anyone who thinks that 2% of GDP is the absolute maximum they should have to pay to live in a secure, free world is delusional. And there are literally countries in Europe that will pick slavery over increasing military spending. They will default to, no, we don't want to spend more than 2% and whatever if Russia invades. If you start at the Baltics, what I just said doesn't apply at all. And as you march west, it becomes more and more true.
Do the Ukrainians feel that Biden should make any changes between now and the end of his term on January 20th? For example, do they think that he should remove restrictions on using attack and missiles to hit targets inside Russia?
Yes, absolutely. The general consensus, and this kind of goes for military people as well, is Biden is a coward and Putin called him on it. And they knew that if Harris won, it was going to be more of the same. It was just going to be the status quo. Here's the weapons, but you can't use them to strike targets that matter. And the fighting was just going to go on indefinitely until Ukraine had bled enough soldiers that they had to admit defeat. That's been the status quo for almost 2 years now, since December of 2022. So average citizens, tired, worn out, they want the fighting to stop. They want there to be a ceasefire. The further west you go, the less they care about territorial integrity, right? Like people in Kyiv don't care about Donbass. The military dudes are just sick of going on pointless missions, knowing that it doesn't matter what we do, it's not going to affect the battlefield. And that goes for my Belarusian regiment, but I think it also goes for the Ukrainian units that I've supported as well. Like everyone is just sick of not being able to change the behavior of their adversary, which is the point of warfare. Like not pointless for me personally. I was like, I did everything that I could, but I mean, I wish my actions could have had a greater effect to the big picture. I don't think they did. The world is in a much worse place now than when I got here. I talked to a couple old dudes, one who was the landlord at the flat I was staying, and he was animated. He made a lot of good points. He said, Russia's playing this long game. There's going to be a ceasefire. They're going to rearm. They're going to try this again in 5 years or two. Whenever they're ready to do it again, they're going to go for it again. The Ukrainians know that is coming, and they need a break. They don't have the bodies to throw at this that Russia does. They also just don't have the physical resources. Like, developing drone technology takes time. Ammunition takes time, especially now that Ukraine has pretty much accepted that they have to build it all themselves. And I would also say the other thing that I have noticed more and more people talking about, which I don't see being reflected in the English language media, is Ukrainians know how nuclear technology works, and their citizens are more than willing to be like, we should just build our own nuclear weapons. It was a mistake to give away our nukes. And the idea that we can survive as a country without nuclear weapons is ridiculous. It doesn't matter who wins this phase of the war. We need nuclear weapons. Otherwise, we'll never be safe. They could probably have a nuclear weapon in like 6 months to a year. And I don't see any policymakers talking about that, taking that seriously,
I do have another line of question. What is the view of the Belarusians in your unit regarding Belarus? Has it changed at all? Are they just waiting for the day that this war ends and then they're going to...
Yeah, no, it's... Oh man, I could talk about this for days as well. So the Belarus is the deciding factor in this war in Eastern Europe, in the fight against totalitarianism in Russia, because it is like the land bridge from Russia to Europe. That's how it is, the threat vector. And Belarusians, I think, naturally understand that, but Westerners do not. So they really do see their territory as occupied territory. Like, they consider it part of the same war. It's the exact war that we're in now. And Ukraine is we call it gray zone. Like, it's contested. And I would say since 2020 and the revolution happened there, the repression apparatus in Belarus, like, to say that could they have another revolution that will overthrow Lukashenko, it's like they're not up against the same regime. The repression apparatus and the punishment system and the concentration camps and everything that's going on in Belarus is so much worse than 4 years ago. I know you guys have had Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya on your show. The challenge she's up against now is way worse than 4 years ago. I think a lot of the guys that are fighting here, they know full well that Lukashenko and his KGB have their sights set on the guys fighting here, because they know these guys are like actual threats. Dudes with guns are an actual threat. Protesters waving flags and singing patriotic songs like they were in 2020, that's not a threat anymore. That's not going to happen. They've neutralized that. So the dudes that are here fighting as partisans, it's a small group relative to the amount of people that fled Belarus after 2020. But they know that they're being hunted. And my best friend, like, he can't talk to his parents anymore. His parents have been threatened by the KGB. Everybody has stories like that. Guys that have kids who they're pretty sure they'll never see again. So it's quite bleak. And I think the dynamic of the conflict is really hard to explain to people that haven't spent a lot of time looking at a map. But if you look at a map, you basically see there's freedom on one side and unfreedom on the other. And in the middle, there's a box with 3 compartments: the Black Sea, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Soviet religion, which is what the Belarusians call it, still controls Belarus, and their eyes are quite open to how bad it is there now.
So this is tragic, but are the numbers being replenished? Belarusians and volunteers in general? I
mean, no, the numbers are down, and they're continuing to go down. Like, the longer the war drags on, the less volunteers there's going to be. I think the hard part for attracting Belarusian volunteers is all the ones that were international outside of Belarus when the invasion of Ukraine started. If any of them that were going to come here, they've all come here. So the only guys left that you could get, guys and gals, because there's female volunteers as well, you would have to get out of Belarus. And I think it's becoming much harder to get out of Belarus. And I think that so many of those people are compromised, like so many of, your partisan protesters that were out waving flags in 2020 that you could convince to come learn how to be a soldier in Ukraine. Like, they know they're compromised. They know that the government's following them, tracking them, threatening them. I think the entire protest movement in 2020 existed on Telegram in Belarus. Telegram is the FSB's app. So I think the odds that you're going to get them out of that country are really, really low.
Did you get medals for actions with them?
I got 2 from my regiment, yeah.
And these are medals particular to the Kalinowski regiment?
I was pretty honored to get them, man. It's pretty dope. One is like the regiment's medal, and then the other one is from the chaplain.
From the chaplain?
Yeah, the regiment has its own chaplain, and he has his own like official medal that he can give out. So I got one from him for being like a team builder or whatever. It's funny that you ask that because when I was going across the border, like I had all my gear with me, and I was literally the only guy on the bus who they searched my luggage because I'm an obvious army guy. They have to inspect you because they're very worried about people like stealing equipment and leaving or fleeing the military or anything like that. And the border guard who was searching me, the first thing he opened was my rucksack, and it also had my medals. And he looked at them, and then he took his phone out and showed me a picture of him getting his medal because I guess he's like National Guard or something. And we like shook hands and hugged. And then he just went through the motions of searching the rest of my stuff. I was really worried about crossing the border with my Kevlar and my helmet and everything. But he just packed it all up and then helped me carry it back to the bus.
Can we step back for just a moment on your story? This is your 4th tour in Ukraine. Can you tell us how you spent those 4 tours?
Yeah, I was in Bakhmut, Chernihiv, Kupiansk, and Kharkiv. But those are a bit misleading, I would say. I was in those directions. So I was in Bakhmut direction. By the time I was actually on the ground, it was falling, and we were doing like our last missions in there where Prigozhin was basically taking it over. So I spent most of my time south of the city in an area called Klishchivka. There's a really important canal that divides that area north and south. I was on the side of that canal with 3rd Assault Brigade when the counteroffensive started in the spring of 2023. And then in the middle of the summer, Prigozhin had his little insurrection, March for Justice, whatever he was calling it. When the dust settled on that, he was going to Belarus. That was what. So obviously, my regiment, which is a Belarusian regiment, thought that was a really big deal. So we actually came off the line and went north in Chernihiv to kind of like, if you look at the intersection of the borders between Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, we were sort of right in there, doing some stuff that was highly unpublicized, in my opinion, not really that effective, because it was kind of like Russia didn't really have the A team up there. So they weren't really trying any maneuvers. And then on the Belarusian side of the border, even though Putin and Lukashenko like to make it seem like there's a huge threat to Ukraine emanating from Belarus, I've never actually seen it. It was like our C team fighting their C team up there, because you could tell they don't have any intention to launch offensives, and neither did we, because we don't want to cross that border and start another front. That was kind of end of summer, early fall 2023. Then we went to Kupiansk, and we were there for 2 or 3 months when the weather started to get really horrible. It's bisected by the Oskil River, which is a very natural boundary that the Russians were trying to push to before the winter.
When was this?
Early or mid-October of 2023. And then we were there right up until about Christmas. It was all defensive. The horrible videos that you see on social media of doing defensives in the mud, we were doing that. It was cold. There was very little maneuver or action going on. It was mostly just dodging mortar rounds.
And I'm sorry to jump in here, but there's actually some reporting now that the Allies, particularly in the European Union, which is pledged to produce a lot of the 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, may actually not have as much capacity as originally estimated, and deliveries have been slow. Are you feeling that at the front?
Yeah, 100%. It's terrifying. When we were in Kupiansk, I remember going on a mission where the fires officer, who was Ukrainian, called me over to his desk, and he's like, "Canadian, come look at this." And he pointed at the whiteboard where they track like the rounds they have and the rounds they used. And we were going out on like a 4 or 5 day mission, and he pointed at the column with the rounds they had. And it was, if I remember correctly, the number was 48. And that's for today, right? And that's what we have. And I was, but you're getting more, right? Because I mean, for our infill, just to get to the zero line, they'll probably spend 20 or 25 rounds. And then when they're hunting Russian guns that are shooting at us, that could take easily in a morning. You could use 20, 25 rounds. So he's telling me we're going out with 48 rounds and there's more coming, right? He's like, I don't know. So we got on the back of the pickup truck and drove out there. And I was in my mind, I was thinking, we might only have mortar cover for half a day, maybe daylight hours while we're out there. And then we'll spend 3-4 days just getting shelled by Russia and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's terrifying as a soldier, just knowing this is not like a big theoretical political debate. When are they going to get the ammo there? It's no, dudes are dying because European capitals can't figure out how to produce mortar rounds that Napoleon figured out how to produce. Yeah, it's terrifying.
In the last 3 months to fight in eastern Ukraine, what has changed?
I'm still kind of processing it myself. I was in Kupiansk for quite a while. And then I went on leave and the unit went in and did another rotations somewhere near Kharkiv, but I forget exactly where. And then I came back, we went into a training cycle, and we knew that the next rotation we were going into was going to be much bigger because we knew we were going to Kharkiv and Russia was signaling that they were going to start another massive offensive towards the city. So we actually spent a long time in training, and the infantry guys, we actually stayed in training for considerably longer than everyone else because they deployed the headquarters and the drones and the mortars and all the enablers. They were actually needed pretty quickly by the Ukrainian brigades that were there because they really, really thought, if you remember back to April, May of this year, Putin and Lavrov were using the phrase sanitary zone or sanitation zone all the time. They were making it they were really telegraphing that they wanted to pretty much reform the international border through Kharkiv Oblast. So everybody, include the Ukrainians, the Western media, decision makers in all the capitals, really thought that the offensive was going to make a run for Kharkiv again. And the last one was a vacation compared to this one. We just finished north of Kharkiv. I think there's a couple of observations I could make. The war is not static. If you took a snapshot every 3 or 4 months, it's a dramatically different war. Each side is adapting, and their use of drones compared to 6 months ago, a year ago, it is just astronomically better. Whereas in the fall of 2023, I don't want to say move around the front whenever we wanted or whatever, but there wasn't this idea that the moment I step outside of the vehicle, there's going to be 30 drones trying to kill me. And now there is that feeling. And those drones have thermal cameras and they're dropping grenades on us and they're literally tracking our every movement. So it's a dramatically different style of soldiering that you have to do because your camouflage and concealment from the air is so much more important to a degree that I couldn't even explain if I had to go back to Canada at the infantry school and tell them, you're going to be doing assaults in ghillie suits. For your listeners, ghillie suits are like what snipers use to sneak around the battlefield. We're doing assaults.
So a type of camouflage suit?
Yeah. Imagine, the movie Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger? Mm-hmm. It's if I could have ghillie suit like Predator had, where I basically just melt into the forest, that's what all of us would be wearing. We spend so much time making overhead cover for the trench. What we're doing now is more serious than World War I. In World War I, your trench had to have some overhead protection because mortar rounds or artillery rounds might send a fragment up into the air that came down onto your trench. But now it's beyond that. If you are exposed at all, you're going to get hit. And both the Ukrainians and the Russians have turned into absolute snipers with their mortar rounds. They don't need a human observer anymore, right? They have a drone to do the observation for them. You don't need a forward artillery officer looking at a target anymore. You have 24/7, 365 drone coverage on any potential target that's in the battlefield. And their mortarmen are on both sides are absolute snipers at this point. If they find your trench, they can get around right into it. It's not an area weapon.
You don't need a person, but someone is still looking through the lens of that These aren't autonomous yet, right? Although that's the next concern, but these aren't.
Yes, looking at it from the ops center through a camera on a drone is way different than being a forward observer where you have to be within visual
danger
range of the target.
It sort of begs the question, though, that based on what you've explained about where you were, the tree line, and that you were actually engaged in an offensive action, what motivates a soldier today? What form of command style will get them across that no man's land? And that's a hard sell. NATO has that mission command where it's almost like everybody sits down for a powwow and then says, let's do this. Whereas the Wagner method is, okay, you don't go across that no man's land and we'll put a sledgehammer to your head. It's also, from the recruitment point of view, not very inspiring to think that this is not just worse than a World War I. It's almost guaranteed suicidal if it's not done to perfection. With the whole combined arms thing working like clockwork to the second. So I don't know how you experienced that or how the Belarusians overcame that trepidation. I get the impression that you're all highly intelligent, actually, and that you know that this has to be done. But for a NATO army to instill that's tough. How do you, as an officer, order troops to cross no man's land? And what is the incentive?
So I think you're really hitting on the crux of the issue is like the why we fight. The reason I joined a Belarusian unit is because I knew they have a why to fight. Their why is so strong. And the other foreign fighters, I don't think, not all, there's lots of good, there's a range of foreign fighters, lots are really good, lots have a really strong why. Your motivation evaporates the moment artillery starts falling on you or anything like that. In the situations I've been in on the battleground here, everybody knows what the point is. The point is get the Russians out of eastern Ukraine. So when we go and we're trying to clear a tree line, the point is push the Russians back to the Russian side of the border. And many of the dudes I work with are extremely intelligent. There's one guy, he's a doctor in my unit. There's dudes that did IT. There's all these guys from backgrounds that aren't military who are extremely intelligent. And because they know why they're fighting and they know what they're trying to achieve, they arrive at really good solutions. Like, how do you cross no man's land and kick the Russians out of their trenches and then take their trenches and continue to pressure them to cross back to the other side of the border? Well, that's a question that has an answer. There is a solution to that problem. We sometimes have to learn it the hard way through injuries and deaths and casualties and stuff. But we do learn it because everybody knows what we're trying to do.
But did you feel in your particular rotation, your operation with the Belarusians, that they were part of a larger scheme?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it has to do with the death toll. Like, we were working with two other GOR units that are like quite elite, and then a ZSU unit, our regular army brigade, who were there when we got there. And definitely the level of coordination between the four units was the highest I've ever seen. I would say because of the nature of the terrain, we definitely were doing stuff that was like battalion level operations, but the individual objectives themselves in this wood line, you couldn't really attack them with more than like a platoon minus, just because of the nature of the terrain. The coordination and the synchronization in particular was really, really good because we were like canalized into this area where it's like, well, we need the artillery to fall in this one particular spot in front of us while we advance forward, and we can only advance in very small teams. And we're, working with Ukrainian teams that are also really well oiled, and we've had lots of time to work with them and learn how each other does business and exchange lessons learned. So I would say it's like we were doing a battalion level operation, but the tip of the spear was usually like section or squad size. So I definitely did feel this rotation. It was the most time I have seen like our team leaders working with team leaders from other units. And it was the most time I spent in other people's trenches. And just to give another shout out to that medic that treated me. So just knowing, man, I got injured and some regular Army Ukrainian unit medical staff was that close to me at the front and gave me immediate treatment. an organizational feat. We all worked together, and it really worked out.
Did you work with mech units? Did you see armor or?
I don't know who the M113 unit was, but they were definitely meched, and they were definitely supporting us because they were saving our guys' lives left, right, and the center. So they were there. I didn't see any mech assaults or anything, though, but we were in absolute light infantry terrain. It's not that there weren't mech units around, there were, but they weren't doing what I was doing, because what we were doing, you had to do dismounted, basically. I felt like I was in a simulator on a career course. It was exactly the way they told me it would be when I was in training as an infantry officer. There is one thing, if there's any Canadians in uniform listening to this, or even just NATO soldiers generally, but especially Canadian Armed Forces members, I was over prepared for this war. Everything I was trained to do, I was scared. I was definitely, there was shit going on all around me that was intimidating, but I never didn't know what to do. From every level, from when I first joined the Russian speaking unit, I was the only English guy there, and they just plopped me in the forest outside Bakhmut. And they were like, okay, this is going to be our fighting position. And I just started digging a trench with some Belarusian who only spoke Russian. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was like, okay, we got to dig this to level 1 so that it's defendable. And then we got to put some overhead concealment up because there's going to be drones looking for us. And then as I progressed along, and, they started to realize I wasn't just like a noob, and they gave me more responsibilities, and I started getting invited to planning meetings and stuff. The planning and the whiteboarding, and like I told one of the Russian speakers and the Ukrainians, whiteboards win wars. Like that's my mantra, whiteboards win wars. We should do everything on a whiteboard. And then they all had whiteboards all of a sudden. And we would literally sit in front of a whiteboard with interpreters and try to work out plans together. And I was literally just doing exactly what I was taught on my captain's career course. I was just doing it with guys that didn't speak English and didn't have the same training as I did. Granted, I was only in the Canadian military, but I think mission command is really good at training junior leaders, your young lieutenants and your master corporals and sergeants. It's really good at training them to explain the why. I'll drop some terminology here, but we use commander's intent statements. We use mission statements. We give main efforts, right? Like anytime you get orders for a mission, you are told what the main effort is, right? Because they want every soldier to know, right down to the no-hook privates, what is the most important thing? What's the vital ground that we have to take here? So we're really good at taking the why we fight and turning it into a process delivered, shared reality, if you will, across the ranks, right from the generals down. Everybody knows what the point of the operation is. But the Canadian Army like over prepared me for this conflict. And I feel like there's so many people in the West right now who are like soldiers that are seeing what's going on, and they're like, oh my God, we would get annihilated on the first day of this war if we were doing what the Ukrainians are doing. And to them I would say, man, trust in your training. We're not as ill prepared for this as you think. This is exactly the fight that our militaries have been training us for.
But one would hope that a major from an infantry background would be prepared for what you went through.
Most of the time, I was not doing stuff that an infantry major. I was an above average rifleman at best a lot of the time. And I know in my army, there's a lot of young corporals and master corporals that could show up here and totally be rock stars, just absolutely know exactly what they were doing. Their navigation skills, their shooting skills, their field craft are beyond the level of this battlefield. And it's not because I was a major. I would actually say a lot of them would be better than me.
Well, again, going back to our previous interview, you made some remarks about the operational level of war.
Mm-hmm.
As I understand, the Ukrainians may have done pretty good in Kursk. Are you noticing that kind of level of expertise now at the staff operational level of planning?
So first off, we didn't have anything to do with Kursk. I didn't even know Kursk was going on until 5 days after it started. Regardless of how it turned out or what Dave Smith thinks of its strategic significance, some serious planning went into that. Like that was definitely a flawlessly executed operational level, to the point where I think the Russians were so stunned. I think it took them days to even figure out that it had happened or what was happening. So it was good that way. But I'd say if you don't have a strategic objective that changes your adversary's behavior, it's a rehearsal, it's practice, it's training. Yeah, okay, you did a divisional level op. That was dope. What was the point? Because if the point was to draw Russian forces away from the Donbass axis, it didn't work. But both sides are so good at the information operations side of the conflict that it's kind of shocking to Westerners because we're so unequipped for it. Making sense of like vehicle losses or ground gained and lost or whatever is easier than figuring out the psychological or cognitive effect that particular battlefield actions have on the adversary's civilian population. Me, Dave Smith, military guy, looking at Kursk, I'm like, this is stupid. I don't know why they're doing this. But, guys like Sersky and Budanov, they look at it and be like, no, we had to scare the Russian population and this worked for what we wanted it for. Or we wanted to derail one of their narratives about Russian victory being inevitable, and it worked. So there are objectives I believe they're pursuing. They're not obvious to Westerners, and they're definitely not obvious to Western military folks like myself, because we've just never thought that way. In fact, we kind of think it's ungentlemanly to psychologically affect the civilians of your adversary's state. How ungentlemanly. Whereas the Ukrainians are like, no, dude, we're definitely doing that. That's the point of the mission.
Okay, so it sounds like that there is a learning curve that the Ukrainian staff are overcoming and honing skills and getting better progressively.
Absolutely.
Possibly faster than the Russians.
I think definitely faster than the Russians, but I would say the tendency in the English language world is to seriously downplay how much the Russians are learning and adapting. We, the democratic world, we still want to believe that they're like the nincompoops that they were 3 years ago, and it's not true.
From the media, there is a formula for the way they conduct an offense. The contemptible term of using meat waves, etc., is associated with them, but it is quite clearly getting results. And
yes,
they
absolutely.
do seem to have integrated not just mortars, but glide bombs, and I think their kill...
Whoa, hold on 1 second. I'm so glad you brought this up. They're not integrated. They use them, but they are not integrated. They their air power and their indirect fire is not integrated with the meat waves. The meat waves are real. The meat waves run at us. We kill them. They die. It's great. The meat waves don't have what you and I would think of as combined arms operations or joint operations. The glide bombs come out, the mortars fall, and we do get by them. But it's not like a bunch of mortars hit me and then an assault ran over me. Like a mortar hit me and the meat wave was somewhere doing something, getting ready or whatever. So they're not integrated. They're still not there yet. And I actually think that I've been here a year and a half now. I haven't actually seen the Russians do anything integrated other than if you consider we're going to send out aircraft to drop, we call them Cubs. I'm not sure what the Russian acronym is, but big bombs, like the equivalent of a JDAM. They come out and they do drop 1,000-pound bombs on us, but then nothing, it doesn't add up to anything. It's not like they have a fire plan where they've decided, okay, like at H-10, we're going to drop these huge bombs to stun this trench system. Then we're going to steamroll over the trench system with a dismounted attack or an armored attack. I have not seen that happen yet. So they are getting better independently. The meat waves are getting better, and the air power is getting better, and the indirect fire is getting better. But I still haven't seen them do what like NATO would consider a joint operation. Does that make sense?
That absolutely does, yes. So
yeah,
that applies to their most elite as well?
Well, I don't know, because you got to remember the infighting in the Russian military system is so huge that their elites are pretty much severed by tribalism, essentially. So if you think Wagner was definitely the most elite mounted light force that they had here, and Wagner imploded. We weren't fighting the elites this summer, I can tell you. We took lots of prisoners I saw them. These guys were conscripts. They had no idea what was going on. They were not elite by any stretch of the imagination. But in the Western context, you would think the more elite the unit, the more assets they get, right? So if you're a special forces unit or if you're some kind of soft unit, you get better indirect fire support. You get better aircraft. You get all of the kind of toys to play with. I don't really think Russia's there, man. Like, I think the VDV and Spetsnaz, whatever, they're probably really good at what they do, the same way Wagner was very good at what they do. But the idea that you're very good at what you do, so we're going to give you the best of the best air support, I don't actually think they're there, because that requires a level of cooperation and coordination that I just don't think like a totalitarian army can achieve, because they're so divided all the time.
As we've spoken before, you pointed out that Clausewitz emphasized that defense is stronger than offense.
Yeah.
Now, you were engaged in an offensive action. And despite the fact that Russia is taking exorbitant casualties in men and materiel, they are nevertheless conducting successful offensives, even though they're not breakthroughs. They are what seems to be battalion tactical groupings generated quickly, and with whatever they've got available in terms of manpower and equipment, they send it forward across a broad front. It's difficult to handle for the Ukrainians. Even though they are inflicting heavy casualties on the Russians, they nevertheless have to retreat. And it seems that counterattacks are not effective.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you were involved in an offensive action. The thing which was mentioned is that the ability to integrate the combat multipliers that you need to make sure that your element gets across the no man's land. Whereas the other side, as you pointed out, is somewhat inept at that. Although the problem may be in command style, they force them across the no man's land. Whereas on your side, because your people were intelligent, they could discuss and get it done in a different way.
I would use a different word than command style. The word I would use is psychology. Like, the Russians accept that attrition is a viable form of warfare. They just think if you have more numbers and you can mass force greater than your enemy at the objective that you're trying to take, their casualty tolerance is higher. They're willing to use more munitions to get it. Because in NATO militaries, attrition is like it's a forbidden word. It's what you avoid, right? We want maneuver, not attrition. And the Russians don't have that psychological block. And I would say the only reason my colleagues and I and the Ukrainians generally take a more maneuverist approach, it's not necessarily that they're psychologically more committed to it. It's just they have no other choice. Like, they're outnumbered and outgunned. The Russians, if they were faced with a similar situation, maybe they would maneuver more as well. But because they have such overwhelming manpower and especially such overwhelming firepower, I would just say their ability to sacrifice human lives to achieve what is, in my opinion, a relatively minuscule objective is incredible. Whatever you've heard in the media, it's understated. Like, they'll literally just throw bodies at it until they get it, if that's what the chain of command wants. So I think it's more of a psychological difference than necessarily a, command style difference or a tactician's difference. It's more of a mentally, they've just accepted what we consider to be the unacceptable.
The 700,000 casualties that they've presumably taken. I mean, that's 70 British armies.
I don't trust any numbers that come out. I'm sure it's insane. So whatever it is, it's not high enough, in Dave Smith's opinion. And the other thing is, both sides are so good at narratives to suit their purposes. The information operations side of the conflict.
Well, Dave, when you say that whatever the casualties are, and I hear you about not trusting figures on both sides, but when you say that they're not high enough on the Russian side to affect the Russian mentality, they are putting different people into the fight. Obviously, there was all the prisoners. You talked about the conscripts last time. There are people from the regions. These are not the sons of the elite in Moscow or St. Petersburg who are going. Yeah. So what do you mean exactly when you say that the casualties aren't high enough to influence the decision-making?
You're talking more like influencing the populace psychologically. I was talking like influence them capability-wise. Like, they're still force-generating soldiers. the conversation we're having is how are you going to influence the will, understanding, or capability of the Russian general staff and the Russian military to continue to conduct offensive operations in eastern Ukraine? Well, if the planning is to affect their capability by diminishing their ability to send soldiers there, it's not working. And it doesn't seem like no matter how many you kill, it's going to work. So they're like the bad guy from the video game. You kill him and he comes back, there's 2 of them. And you kill both of them and then there's 3 of them. That's how Russian soldiers appear right now.
Right. But it's axiomatic that if you're going to succeed at some point, you've got to take the offensive.
Yes.
Even if it's a counterattack to retake ground that was lost. Yeah. And I'm getting the impression that Ukraine is not able to do that.
They're not, no, especially in particular sectors of the front.
So what's, you said it right there, that attrition seems to be a dirty word in NATO.
Yeah.
As well. So
there's actually, sorry to interrupt, but because there's actually a few sacred cows that have been knocked down while I was here. One is attrition is a completely legitimate form of warfare. Like, it absolutely works. And the way NATO kind of indoctrinates its officers, and I use that word, like, that's what they call it. They call it indoctrination. I'm not using that as a pejorative. Like, they told me I was in indoc, like I was being indoctrinated. The fact that they just tell you, like, maneuver good, attrition bad, even if you're never going to do it, it's extremely limiting in how you think about your enemy, right? If you think that obviously maneuver is the best way to go in every possible case, and you suddenly are confronted with an adversary who's like, Dad, I do attrition, right? Well, now you've never had to go through his thought process. You've never had to think like him. I think teaching junior officers and then majors and lieutenant colonels in staff college, teaching them that attrition is like this dirty word that we never talk about is debilitating, right? Because now you can't understand an enemy who thinks that way. So that's one sacred cow. And the other one that I would say is, like, siege warfare is still a thing. The Russians and the Ukrainians, they regularly pick a town or a village and just decide they're going to siege it like it's medieval times. And when I say siege, I mean Bakhmut was a siege battle. There was no maneuver. It was not an attrition battle. It was just block by block, inch by inch, seize everything and destroy it if you have to, which predates Clausewitz and everybody. But Russia has proven a few times now it works. You destroy everything, but then you control it.
Well, one thing that's noticeable is that they can extemporize a force not adverse to attrition.
Yeah.
In fact, they use it as part of their success mechanism in a way. So their brigade staffs can throw together whatever's available into a battalion tactical grouping attack vector with, maybe 100 guys who don't want to be there and vehicle drivers who also don't want to be there. And they can actually have the authority to order soldiers into a situation that is, the survival rate is so low and they know it. Now, that is a technique which is just totally alien to NATO. How do you tell soldiers that this is where your start line is and that's where your end line is, and there's no ands, ifs, or buts? That's where you've got to go. But as you pointed out, attrition works. But the fact that they can generate this so quickly and to use this kind of outflanking effort, whatever the stronghold is, whether it's Volodar or Chasiv Yar or wherever, they've successfully done this, and it's very hard to respond to it, especially if you've got a command style that requires everybody to get, as you pointed out, the main effort, what we're doing, and every soldier to realize that this is why we're doing it. They don't have the why. They don't even bother with it. It's like,
I wouldn't go that far. You got to remember, having an objective that's understood, even if it's ridiculous or insane, is much more effective than not having an objective. The simpler your objective is, the more likely it is you are to achieve it. There's also just something different in the Slavic psyche about suffering. This attitude of I'm going to go do it. I might die. It's pretty normal here. It's normal amongst the Ukrainians as well, less so than the Russians. But I think that 20 years of the global war on terror really, really did damage to NATO. Like, it's made us so risk adverse and so casualty adverse. If you can't prove that every single dude is going to come home safe, you don't get to go do the mission. And that only works when the combat is optional. Like, when you don't have to go assault bin Laden's compound, you're just doing it because you can. Your risk calculus is way out of whack compared to conventional warfare. Conventional warfare is like, you don't have a choice. Like, yeah, you're going to take casualties, figure out how to minimize them and move on, take the objective. And because NATO has gotten itself into these weird missions for the last 20 years, if you talk about like Afghanistan post about 2005, 2006, or Iraq the whole time we were there, nobody knew what the hell the end state was. Nobody knew what the main effort was. There was no unity of effort. You couldn't coordinate vast groups of people because nobody knew what it was they were trying to achieve.
You were a relatively high-ranking former NATO officer, okay?
Sure.
So it is a very rare phenomenon for a NATO officer to have been through what you've been through. You've experienced real combat, peer-to-peer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you say that NATO understands combined arms in theory, right? But they've never really had to practice it in this kind of environment.
Mm-hmm.
So would it be fair to say that the Russians are ahead or on a par, or if something was to happen such that there was an armistice or a negotiated peace and Ukraine was in a holding pattern for the next offensive, is NATO ready for a Russian action on a large scale? I mean, that's a hypothetical. I know that some of Eastern European countries are suggesting something like that. Do you think there is an advantage that the Russians have at the moment over NATO?
I think, oh man, we could have a 3-hour podcast just about this one question. So I'm just going to stream of consciousness some of the things that my mind has changed since I got here. Rather, I can't give you a straight up answer to your question. But so the first one is my respect for NATO has skyrocketed since I got here. I was one of those bitter mid-level officers who thought NATO was just a dysfunctional joke. I would actually say NATO is an incredibly functional military alliance. We're really impressive. I spent 4 years as a joint terminal attack controller, which is like an army guy that calls in airstrikes from the Air Force. And I can tell you, I did huge NATO exercises. I worked with in the double digits of NATO countries doing that job. We have like standardized procedures. I was embedded with an infantry platoon from the Czech Republic for 3 weeks on an exercise about 10 years ago. And I was an infantry officer talking to airplanes, and they were an infantry platoon. And I knew exactly what they were doing all the time. They understood what I was doing all the time because we had the same doctrine, the same TTPs. And even if we didn't have the same TTPs, we had the same points of reference. I could say like, hey, doctrinally, this is the way I was taught to do this, but I don't always do it that way. What do you guys think? And they'd be like, oh yeah, we have the same doctrine, but we don't do it that way either. We do it differently than the doctrine and differently than you. So I feel like that shared approach to warfighting is kind of the secret sauce that makes NATO so threatening. And it's why totalitarian dictators are terrified of NATO. Iran, Russia, North Korea, they'll want the same things. They want to overthrow us, kill us, take our stuff. They're never truly going to have a joint doctrine that is multinational because they never trust each other. Whereas me and my counterpart from the Czech Republic army, we trusted each other. So we had the same doctrine. And I would definitely say, being a former NATO officer watching Ukraine fight Russia, the analogy I use all the time is I feel like a jock watching two nerds fight. It's like two dorks from the drama club are fighting each other, and I'm the captain of the football team, and I have to watch it and be like, oh man, you guys really don't know what you're doing. And the reason for that is like, former Soviet countries, other than the ones that joined NATO, the reason they don't know how to do combined arms operations, they haven't actually figured it out yet. They're just not there. And a first-year captain from any NATO country could plan a better invasion than the Russian military planned in February of 2022.
That's a more positive outlook from our last conversation. You were saying that the drone potential of the Russians would possibly take out an entire battalion, and that would be a wake-up call for NATO.
I do still think that is going to have to be the price we pay. Unfortunately, like, I'm sorry to say it, but a whole bunch of my colleagues back in the NATO militaries are going to have to get utterly murdered before anyone wakes up and realizes not only how far along the totalitarians are, but how motivated they are. I don't want to diminish the experience the Russians have, right? Like, they are learning through blood, sweat, and tears, and especially a lot of blood. They're learning lessons that are going to give them an incredible advantage in any conflict in the future. We in the NATO countries don't have, and I still, I hate to sound pessimistic, but I still think the NATO countries are going to have to learn those lessons in blood as well before they learn them. Like, they're not going to learn them through a lessons learned campaign, unfortunately.
But I think what you're saying is that nevertheless, the NATO countries are a well-oiled machine waiting to be kicked into gear, as it were. But there's a time factor.
I would just say divide that politically and militarily. Like, militarily, yes, I agree with what you just said. Politically, no. NATO as a political alliance sucks. If you put Estonia or Poland in charge of everything, maybe it would work. But, you know, our problem right now is not like, do we fight better than they do? Yeah, yes, we do fight better. NATO fights better than Russia does. But Russia has the will to fight and NATO doesn't. You know what I mean? So Russia produces more artillery rounds than the entire free world combined. And Russia produces more tanks than all NATO countries combined. Russia can call up their evil friends like North Korea to be like, hey, we want even more munitions. Can you give us that? And they're like, yeah, of course we can. We'll never cooperate with you. But in this one specific transactional instance, we will give you stuff. So NATO as a political alliance is an utter failure. It does not work. And it doesn't work because NATO countries just can't seem to get together and realize the seriousness of the threat. And the only ones that can are Eastern Europe, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. They understand how serious the threat is. France, Britain, Canada, the US do not. So as a result, a bunch of people that are really good at cooperating, coordinating, fighting, according to common doctrine or whatnot, and just really bad at having the political will to do anything. Forget fighting. They can't even have the political will to manufacture munitions. I honestly think Estonia could be invaded tomorrow. And until regiments of Canadians get annihilated the way they did in World War I, Canada won't wake up and realize they need a military-industrial complex. It's great that NATO is this incredibly functional military alliance. But if you don't have the political willpower to employ your military and to use them to achieve policy aims, you get the greatest military in the world. If the politicians can't figure out how to employ it, it doesn't matter. And this idea that the fighting is going to stop and somehow, like, the Russian military will go back to sucking the way they did 3 years ago, that is a pipe dream that's not going to happen. It's going to get worse.
It's fair to say that they will capitalize on the lessons that they've learned.
100%. The Russians also, like, the thing we don't really give them credit for, the way they integrate military strategy into their political strategy is just so much better than the way Westerners do. Like, they know as long as they keep the fight going, Westerners are so terrified of escalation. They're invading another country and genociding its people. Like, how much more escalation can there be?
Right. But a fear I've had, and that is that what we're seeing with the North Koreans is just the tip of the iceberg, and that what really is going to happen is, you look at NATO on one side, particularly during the Cold War, you know, there was a Warsaw Pact on the other. It is not inconceivable for the Chinese to send 10 to 20 brigades to the Russian NATO front as a part of their pact, their Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Back in 1904, Mackinder, when he wrote about the heartland, saying that whoever controls the heartland controls the world. You've got Russia and China, they're connected, and so is North Korea. They have interior lines. That's a huge advantage to get from Europe to Asia. You just cross via the Belt and Road, and I mean, obviously you can fly, but that's very expensive. As some in East Europe are saying, the likelihood of Russia doing something is not necessarily 10 years from now, but rather in 3. And we're talking the same with Xi Jinping. Now, if that is done with a geostrategic plan that is somewhat coordinated with Putin and Xi Jinping, you've got a problem if you're a NATO, because force transference is a huge issue. And if the United States is going to pivot even more to the Pacific and relegate to NATO to its own actions, and even though you're correct in saying that the dictatorships don't work together, when it comes to ultimately wanting to win, they may go that far. And that is what we're seeing with these North Koreans. I think this is just a portent of things to come.
I would say two things about that. Number one, for China and North Korea, like their militaries are black boxes to them. They don't know how they're going to perform, right? If you remember, like Russia had a pretty exercised military in 2022, and they grossly underestimated what they were getting themselves into. And they've been fighting wars consistently since the end of the Cold War. They've done Chechen wars, Georgia, Syria, Ukraine the first time, and they really didn't know what they're doing. North Korea, to my knowledge, they haven't conducted a single military operation since like 1953. So they're going to suck. You might be correct in that like China and North Korea could seriously reinforce Russia's western flank. I really do think one of the reasons Xi Jinping hasn't taken military action in any meaningful way yet is he knows his military is completely green and doesn't know what they're doing. The problem is once you act, then everyone has a data point. His big comparative advantage right now is everyone's afraid of him because of the mystery. They don't know what's going to happen. I don't think the fear is like if you came to a head-to-head fight between NATO and call it the Eurasian Alliance or whatever. I don't think that's all that scary. And like, yeah, NATO soldiers don't have combat experience like you would get in Eastern Ukraine, but they are very mentally prepared. Like they're well trained. They have better doctrine. They have better equipment. They're used to working together. So they're mentally more prepared. If I could make a really fine distinction that I hope you'll understand, they're mentally prepared. They're just not psychologically prepared. But the other side's not either. And they also suck, right? Like just in like sheer military terms, like NATO would just fly circles around them. To end on a hopeful note here, I would say I spent a lot of time in a NATO military. I think NATO militarily is the greatest alliance, the greatest force history's ever known. But as a political alliance, it's a completely dysfunctional mess. And the best thing military people like myself can do, if we do have to go to war, it's like, okay, the politicians finally sorted their shit out. Let's go be the rock star military alliance that we are. In the Ukrainians, we have this great term. I love it. I use it all the time. I'm thinking about getting it tattooed on me. It's Pracujemy Razem. We work together. In NATO, like Pracujemy Razem.
So is there a prospect of you possibly getting back into uniform?
My absolute dream would be if they'd let me rejoin the Canadian Army and just be the chief instructor at the infantry school and just tell young soldiers, I went to World War III and it was exactly the way the sergeant majors told me it would be. So take this stuff very seriously because digging a trench and learning how to use overhead concealment will save your life. And the fight absolutely is coming. I don't want my country's next generation of young men to get slaughtered, which unfortunately right now I think they would.
People must appreciate what you've done.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I'm the chief of defense. Tell her that you said that.
Dave Smith, thank you so much for generously making time to speak with us 3 times. I'm certain that our listeners will really benefit from your many insights.
Yes, Dave, we're indebted to you for the time you spent with us, and it's been a privilege. And those medals, they speak volume. And good luck. And that's it from the Delegates Lounge. We'd like to thank our esteemed guests who've graciously allowed us to share their hard-earned insights into what really matters. And then there's you, our listeners, who we hope are sufficiently edified to clamour for more of the same. Do drop in for a weekly episode on Thursday or from time to time if we're on the road for special events, in which case there'll be a bonus episode. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like what you've heard, please take a moment to rate or review the show, as it helps others who share your abiding interest in world affairs to find their way to the Delegates Lounge. You can connect with us on many popular social media platforms or reach out to us directly at info@thedelegateslounge.com. We're a small team, so we can't respond to every message, but we will read them. Our show this week was written and produced by the host and by yours truly, executive producer Frank Radford. Until next time, keep calm and curious.